The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
The first saint we're going to talk with today is Saint Basil the Great. And what's interesting about him is that he was born in Caesarea. He was born in Israel, and so there's that whole sense of his roots being there. But we know that he is a patron of hospital administrators. I wonder why we would call him that, because hospitals obviously weren't a part of his life and times, but what would make someone a patron of a hospital administrator?
Well, and it's interesting, sometimes there's very direct connections with why this person's a patron of this or that. To the best of our knowledge, we could look at his life of faithfulness. He was a very educated man, constantly involved in activity, immensely part of charity. And so if you want to look at a hospital administrator, they have to be very knowledgeable, they have to deal with a lot of activity, and at the heart, the hospital structure would have been one that was really centered or partnered with charity along the way. We can immerse ourselves so much in the knowledge today of health care and the Affordable Care Act, and do I have enough, insurance to go to this nursing home, or all these things. But around his time, the work of taking care of the poor was a charitable endeavor. And so we would see, that there is that charity, that knowledge, all that was involved in his life, and they would have, people would look back and say, well, there's a connection here.
I think another interesting thing is that, and this is very unusual in the life of this particular saint, was that his parents were saint, his brothers and sisters were saints, and so there's that whole sense that he came from a family of saints. How unusual that is. Oftentimes when we look at the lives of the saints, we don't always say that their parents were saints or their relatives were saints. It's very unusual that happens, and so his life would have been surrounded by that whole sense of living the godlike life through his parents, through his siblings, through his own very existence. And the other interesting thing is that once he was ordained to the priesthood, he then became bishop of his own hometown. And so that oftentimes reminds us that back during that time, someone was elected a bishop by the acclamation of the people. It wasn't necessarily a designation that the Pope gave. And so people in his hometown would have understood his charism of charity and generosity, because that was what his family was like, and that is what his brothers and sisters were like. Isn't that a wonderful thing, to be known for having your family being that religious or that faith-filled?
Oh, absolutely. And when you talk about that, becoming bishop by acclamation, and the people, that rising up, and I think the last time, we don't do that anymore in the life of the church, but the last time there would have been any great uprising, grassroots support for someone, I could think back not too far to the funeral of John Paul II, that they were calling for sainthood now. They were giving him the title John Paul the Great, having been dead for less than 24 hours as everything started to unfold. So you see that grassroots support. But I would think you're right on target. What were people looking for? What do people look for in leadership? Are they always now, I would argue, yes, you need to have a keen mind, and we have to be aware of different aspects in that. And so when the church is looking to appoint leaders for dioceses or for parishes, they have to have a vast knowledge of different disciplines. But the people are also looking for it to be enacted in a faith-filled and charitable way. That's what the people of Caesarea were looking for. That's what they found in him, and they would have known that story very well. They would have looked at his parents, and they weren't saints when he was made, bishop, but they would have seen this long-standing legacy of charity, of love, of mercy, of peace, that emanated his whole family structure.
Well, what's also interesting is that Basil actually had it all. He was not only known as a person of charity, but he was also known for his knowledge of things, his eloquence, his learning, and so there's that whole sense that he kind of encapsulated in his very life what would have been a wonderful example for those who were trying to search for meaning in life, or even those who were early followers of the Lord. Because he was ordained in 370, several years after the legalization of Christianity, but yet there's this whole sense that he did all of this in a spirit of humility and charity, because he eventually earned the title of great. There are very few, as you had mentioned about Saint Pope John Paul II, there are very, very few saints in the history of the Church that have that title of the great after their name, and he is one of them for a very particular reason. Let's talk also about his life as a doctor of the Church. Why would the Church declare someone a doctor, and what does that designation mean?
Well, it's a very select designation, much like the great. It doesn't automatically come with sainthood. It usually is done afterwards, and it is a recognition of, and when we say doctor of the Church, it's interesting, we're not talking medical at all. We're talking about him being the patron of hospital administrators. And it doesn't mean that someone had a variety of degrees, but their writings, their preaching, their teaching left a long-standing legacy for the Church, that if you can ascribe to what they taught, what they wrote, what they espoused during their life, it is the best education you could get. If you want to talk about doctor in the sense of an academic, they are laying out a lesson plan that if you follow this is how you can come to know the Lord. This is how you can come to know salvation. This is what we need to be doing with our lives. We have a few women doctors of the Church, more men, and he is certainly one of those that we look at his writings. And when you talked about his, I just want to segue a little bit back to when you talked about he had it all and the attributes that you gave him. From time to time when you find yourself in a political season, different polls are done, and what are we looking for in the perfect candidate? And sometimes we don't find perfection in all our candidates, and so this one's doing well in the polls because he or she can empathize with me. I feel like they care about what's important to me. But then you'll have other people that what I'm looking for is I want someone who knows how to deal with issues. I want someone who has a knowledge and an understanding and someone who has that experience. And I think he'd be the perfect politician of his time. And so maybe that's what made him the perfect bishop of his time, because people could look at him and say, he's got experience. He knows what needs to be done. But he knows what the ordinary person like me needs. He feels my pain, one of those phrases, from elections gone past. And when we talk about a doctor of the Church, inviting us through their life and their writings and their teachings to discover our way, he's speaking very clearly to what we need to discover, all of us, as we move forward in our current way.
We're going to talk about a friend of Basil the Great in just a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I spent 34 years as a teacher.
I just loved interacting with the students.
Many sisters, brothers, and religious order priests served for little pay, and now their communities lack retirement funds.
My very first class had 56 first graders.
Gifts to the Retirement Fund for Religious help provide for medications, nursing care, and more. Please give to those who have given a lifetime. Donate at your local parish.
God bless you for your help.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her. Instead of sitting on the couch, I helped to clean up. I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I sent my husband a love email.
What have I done for my marriage today? It's a good question.
I gave her a call and say, thinking of it. And the kids.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
We're going to the museums as a family.
What have I done for my marriage today?
I made my wife coffee and breakfast this morning.
It's going to be her birthday next week, so I've been spending time today making arrangements to make that extra special.
Oh, we're spending the day together.
I bought her an orchid.
Hassan was able to let me sleep in by taking care of him in the morning.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. She's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Small changes can make a world of difference. Get started at foryourmarriage.org. A message from the Catholic Church.
Welcome back to our show. We're talking now about Gregory Nanzianzen. It's interesting because we, a moment ago, was speaking about Basil the Great, who was a friend of Gregory's. Let's kind of set the scene as to what was Gregory Nanzianzen's life like, and was he living around the same time, around the same area? What information can we give the folks that are with us?
Well, it's interesting, he's born in, as you mentioned, 329. He dies in 390, so his life is encapsulated within the 4th century of the church. He's born and dies in Asia. He studies theology with Basil. He goes to Alexandria to study with Athanasius, another saint of the church. Again, we have to remember Eastern Church. His father was a priest. He was ordained by his father. Again, we can't put that on a 21st century Western Roman Catholicity. But this is, so we know that when we spoke of Basil, the holiness of the family. Well, there would have been a similar pattern in Gregory's life as well. His father's a priest, so he's raised, he's steeped in all of this. Again, born completely within the time that the church is legal, not that there aren't difficulties or challenges. What we move into in his life, though, is, and we've touched on this in previous episodes of the Communion of Saints, once the church is made legal, now what are we going to do? And so you see the evolution of how to create a structure for the church. And so what's very important, and what encapsulates all of Gregory's lifetime and then even spills over, is we talk about the creed, the basic tenets of our faith. And we see that evolution of development of that starts just a few years before he's born in 325, isn't really completely formalized until the mid-5th century, 431, after he's dead. But there are aspects going on in some of those early councils that very much he is involved in and a champion of.
What's interesting is that also says something about the theology and the history of the church. It's a developing thing. It's not something that, oh, this happened and that's it. We know everything there is about it. The life of the church continues to grow and to unfold and so forth. There's certain doctrines of our faith that are unchangeable. We know that God is unchangeable, but there are certain things that we come to understand a little more clearly as we talk about them, as we learn more about what was going on at the time, when we understand more about the language that certain things were written or talked about. And so as a theologian, Gregory would have been part of this ongoing discussion about the basic truths of our faith. And one of the things that really sets him apart from the Eastern Church is the whole sense of, in the Nicene Creed, we say that the Son comes from, or the Spirit comes from the Father and the Son. The Eastern Church believes that the Spirit came from the Father alone. In Latin, we have that phrase, or that word filioque, and the Son. And so there's almost like a bridge that Gregory Nanzianzen becomes with the Eastern and the Western Church. And isn't that really kind of fundamental, that we in our own lives, not just the saints, are really called to be bridges between people, between events, between ideologies and theologies, how important that symbol is, that we kind of span and we allow people to come back and forth and we enable that discussion. Isn't that important to the life of the church?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you bring out a very clear point, and it goes to the knowledge of the church. We don't all have to become doctors of the church. We don't all have to get degrees, but that basic understanding of how the church has evolved. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes. That's where our knowledge and our understanding of our faith is important. We're 50 years from the Second Vatican Council. For many people now, we have to understand they don't even know what we mean when we say, Vatican II. If they were born completely after it, just depends on what type of parish they were part of, to whether there were hold on, to past ways of doing things. But I think for people that still conjures a little bit of a division, and that little of it was better when we, before when we did this, it really is denying that constant evolution of the church. That a lot of the things that we just know now took centuries to develop and to evolve. And I think the more we know and understand those things, the more open we are to understanding people's points of view, where they're at in the church. I oftentimes say people get very comfortable on a calendar year, and they just want to sit on it. And I've used the example all the time. People will say, well, I liked it back when we used to do it the way we always did it, or the original way. And if you just want to take the liturgy itself, well, if you like it how it was always done or how it was first done, it's 13 men sitting in a room on cushions passing platters of bread and cups of wine, and at the end of the night, one went and hung himself and the other one was arrested. Are we going to act that out every week? We evolve, we grow, and we need to continue to be bridges to expand and understand why some people have difficulties, but to continue to bring people along. It doesn't mean be insulting, or say my way is better than your way, but that evolution and that bringing people along so that we can continue to grow in our understanding and our faith.
One little point that we'd like to make is that Gregory, Nanzianzen, and Basil the Great, the first saint we spoke about in our first segment, were friends. So the church celebrates their friendship and their sainthood on the same day, January 2nd. And how interesting that the church chose to do that, because here are two people, Basil from the Eastern Church, Gregory also from the Eastern Church, but who, because of his capacity for understanding the truths of the faith, becomes a bridge with the Western Church. And so the church, in her wisdom, sees the unity between the two, and celebrating on January 2nd for us as Catholics right after the new year. What does that say in our last minute of this segment together about that?
Well, I think although we in our liturgy begin with the first Sunday of Advent, we do recognize the beginning of a calendar year, but it's also having just celebrated the octave of Christmas. And so we're steeped in that life of Christ that now sends us forth. And so I think having them placed together, we recognize, how are we going to go out for the year? How are we going to go out and carry all that we have received, all that we have witnessed? How are we going to witness to our faith? How are we going to be a bridge to others? How are we going to continue to profess our faith? I think they kind of allow that, and my fear is sometimes they kind of get lost in the shuffle of, oh, Mary the Mother of God, then we're getting ready for Epiphany. Sometimes people don't even look at those saints during those 2 weeks, but I think we need to look at them, and we need to allow them to speak to us and be that bridge that leads us to our faith and our service with others.
We're going to talk about another servant of God in just a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
There is a place where a total stranger will give you their blood. A place where someone you never knew will save your child from drowning. Where a person who doesn't look like you, talk like you, or dress like you will give you shelter after a flood. That place is called America, where we look out for each other. When you help the American Red Cross, you help America.
Welcome back to our show. The saint we're going to talk about and with today is Elizabeth Ann Seton. Many of the folks that are with us have heard her name, unlike the first two saints we spoke about. What makes Elizabeth Ann Seton such, not necessarily a household word, but someone who is more recognizable in the life of the church?
Well, I think the first thing that makes her more recognizable to us, and it is perhaps the one thing she is most noted for, in addition to other aspects of her life, is that she is the first native-born citizen of the United States to become a saint. She was born here in the United States just a few years before the outbreak of the American Revolution. She's born Episcopalian and lives as an Episcopalian for 2/3 of her life, for the first 30 years of her life. But she was the first person who was actually born on this soil who then becomes a saint. That's very important when you think of how far we as a country have come in our acceptance of people of different faiths. We might think that this is the land of the free and this is where everyone had an opportunity and the American dream and we are that great melting pot. It wasn't necessarily always the case. We see that in certain ethnicities and we certainly see it in different religions. And so for a Catholic in the United States to be able to look and say, look at this person, that we have saints here. You know, the Catholic Church has this happening right here in our country. Big shift, you know, a big change for us.
And how unusual it would have been during the time that she lived to really become a convert to Catholicism. You know, around this time of the American Revolution, Catholicism was really not something that was lifted up as being a religion that was celebrated in the American states. And so it would have been a difficult time as well. And yet we find that this woman also, we talk about vocation as well. You know, when God issues a vocation, it's not always readily received. You know, we know that Elizabeth Ann Seton first embarks on married life and then becomes a religious woman. And how often we see that in our church today. Many of the women who are either widows or later in life become religious because there's this call that God issues early on in their life that they don't necessarily accept right away for whatever circumstances. And her circumstances were such that she did not until later in her life. Tell us a little bit about what else was going on during the time of Elizabeth Ann Seton's life.
Well, and for Elizabeth, you know, there would have been in her Protestant life, post-Revolutionary War, married, children. There's a little bit of means, a little bit of society life. That is kind of all taken away from her. You know, her husband dies, left rather impoverished. And I think she is one who, in her vocations, if we could say that of her, is there wasn't, we have no reason to believe that as a young Episcopalian girl she always wanted to be a Catholic nun. You know, she answered the call of a vocation to married life, to have children, but she invited the circumstances of her life to open her up to the possibility of a vocation. I think that's another aspect maybe we need to invite people to recognize, that we talked previously about second career vocations. It doesn't mean that you weren't fulfilled or happy in the life that you had. We certainly don't want people to think life was horrible until I became this. But to embrace the opportunities or the circumstances you find yourself in. I think for Elizabeth, the circumstances brought her to a deepening understanding of who the Lord was. For her, in her challenges and difficulties, she found joy in inviting this new relationship with the Lord. Not that she didn't have one, but in this new faith for her. She found it to be, as I like to tell people, if you're thinking of converting to the Catholic faith, it really needs to become the best expression of your relationship with the Lord. You can't become a cafeteria Catholic from day one. So whatever your religion is, it should be the best expression of your relationship with the Lord. Elizabeth finds that is through the Catholic faith. She then wants to offer this to her children as well. And what she also, aside from being the first native-born saint, is most noted for is her endeavors in the American Catholic school system. She develops the first free Catholic school, primarily to educate her children and other Catholic children in her area, but it really then develops and emerges into the Catholic system that we have in our country right now.
Let's talk in the last few minutes of our time together in the show about Catholic schools, because we know in the lives of many of the saints, they have been very instrumental in teaching children. We could name several saints that was their avocation, that was their charism. What is so important about Catholic schools, not only here locally, but around the country?
Well, I think if we even look back to when Elizabeth Seton started this, and then certainly as they emerge and grow deep into the 1800s, into the 19th century, one of the things about a Catholic school was there was this suspicion of Catholics. Because we are an immigrant church, the Catholic Church by and large grows in the United States with the emergence of an immigrant population. Why it was not so large was we were a country that was predominantly founded with English settlers. You had small pockets of Spanish settlers and people of other regions from Europe, but by and large English, so by and large Protestant. As you start to see the waves of immigration, the Irish, the Italian, Eastern European, they bring with them their Catholic faith, and so it's part and parcel of suspicion. I'm suspicious of you coming from Italy, and you've brought this faith. I'm suspicious of these Irish, they left because they had no food, and now they come here and they want to take jobs from us, and they bring this faith with them. So the Catholic schools emerge also as an immigrant school system where there would have been great discrimination. They really weren't welcome in the public school structure. So it really runs as a parallel school system that also embarks on and invites a knowledge of the faith. And it does become part and parcel. You become, if you ask many people of older generations, what are you? That question of what are you ask a young person what they are, they're going to tell you where they go to school or what they do for a living. You ask an older person, what are you? I'm Italian, I'm Catholic. I'm Irish, I'm Catholic. It became what you were. But the emergence of the Catholic school system really was first built on discrimination, but then flourished into being accepted in society, and really then became the bedrock of what people wanted for education, where it goes from discrimination to people who are not Catholic seeing the value of a Catholic university or a Catholic high school or even a Catholic elementary school. And to this day, though economics and vocations and demographics have played a part in maybe weakening the presence of Catholic schools in certain parts of the country, they're still seen as the place that are there to educate young people, and predominantly in poorer communities, trying to provide that quality education.
We thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.